Right, good afternoon. Welcome back to another episode of the Last Days series. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to go through this specific content this morning all in one go. As you know, I try and keep things quite sort of short and sharp as far as possible. But I also don't want to rush. So let's just see how we go today. I've been pondering how do we come about to a 6,000 year or 7,000 year Earth chronology, Earth time scale. Some people will say, well, Genesis 1, God made 7 days, and then they refer to the book of Peter that says a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord and 1,000 years is like a day. And I've struggled with that idea personally because it's easy to overread or read too much into Scripture that Scripture is not really saying. And for me, that Peter Scripture about a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day is really just saying that God is outside of our time dimensionality. To Him, time is not the same as we understand time. Now, of course, there could be relevance. There could be, it is possible that a day is like 1,000 years. But the reality is, to God, a day is like 50 years, or 50 years is like 250 seconds. Because He's outside of our time dimensionality. So I've always struggled with that idea. I came across the Scripture, and I've been pondering this for a while and preparing and studying and getting into. And this is now what I would like to get into this morning. In Genesis 6, Genesis 6, 1, 2, 3. When man began to increase in number on the earth, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal, and his days will be 120 years. Now that statement of his days being 120 years, in my view, stands out singularly throughout the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation. There really isn't much that ties into 120 years in terms of the length or lifespan of man, And so I've really spent a lot of time pondering, meditating, studying, so let's get into it and just consider this. Some people say that 120 years that God was talking about was the duration of time before the flood, and this can't be the case for a couple of reasons. Number one, if we just factor in God's heart as He makes the statement, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. I don't know about you, but I feel the love of God in me. I feel like God is saying, I love man so much, but they've become perishable. I can't let them live forever in a perishable state. At some point, we have to make them imperishable. We have to return sort of the eternality of man, the perpetuality of man, the imperishability of man. I feel when I factor in God's love into that statement, that's what I'm hearing. It's like, I can't leave them in this condition forever, so I'm going to put a limit of 120 years. Okay. And then secondly, another reason why it can't be the duration before the flood is because we see in Genesis 5 verse 32 is that Noah was 500 years old when he had his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then in Genesis 6:10, it tells us Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then further on, then God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all of this. So Noah had his sons before God said to him, I'm going to put an end to it. You see. So, and we know then in Genesis 7:6 that Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. So it definitely took less than 100 years for Noah to finish building the ark. Okay, so that doesn't correlate with 120 years that God was speaking about. What's the other option? Well, the age of man, the lifespan of a human. And this is problematic. So what we see before Genesis 5, massive lifespans. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912 years. Methuselah is the oldest person ever mentioned, 969 years. They lived a long time before Genesis 5. Okay, what do we see after the flood? Well, Shem lived to be 500 years old, and Arphaxad 403, and it just rapidly decreased down to Nahor, who was 119 years old. Okay, and of course Terah came after him. He was 205 years old. But we see this massive decrease in human lifespan. Still nothing around 120 years. Okay, but what we do see further in Psalm 90 verse 10 is that the length of our days are 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. That speaks literally about how long a human will live. And now if you had to go Google it, average age of man, you'll see that the average age of man on the planet at the moment is 79 years. And that fits perfectly with the Psalm 90 verse 10 understanding of the lifespan of a single human. Okay, so once again, God's 120 years doesn't line up with the lifespan of an individual human. Okay. Then we have the duration of a generation. It's immediately problematic to start thinking about this, because in Genesis 6:1-3, God says that it's mankind, so it's the totality of man that he will not contend with. It's not one human or one generation of humans. It's the total capacity of all humans who ever were, currently are, and are yet still to be. He will not contend with all of mankind, okay, forever. So we already have a problem there about thinking about generations. But nonetheless, if we think about it a bit further, in Genesis 15 verse 13-16, we see that God speaks about the descendants of Abraham being mistreated for 400 years in Egypt, becoming enslaved and abused and whatever else for 400 years in Egypt. And he says that in the fourth generation, they will be brought out. So 400 years or fourth generation. So that's in God's mathematics. A generation is sort of around maximum 100 years. Okay, so there we see what God is not talking about in those first three ideas. All right, so the only one that seems to make a bit of sense to me anyway is what I'm going to call the Jubilee year theory. Okay, now again, Genesis 6:1-3, man there is referring to mankind, which I just alluded to a few moments ago. Mankind. It's not one man, it's not one generation, it's the entirety of humanity in a mortal condition. Okay, that's the definition and the meaning of that word man. Days, the word days in that same scripture, Genesis 6:1-3, it's plural and singular. So it's, for example, us in the English-speaking language, we'll say a lifetime. So a lifetime, it's singular, it's one lifetime, but it contains many years, days, months, weeks, seconds, hours and seconds. You know what I'm saying? So there's plurality, even though there's a singular. Okay, so many days. A singular duration of time comprised of multiple or shorter periods of time, which is what I was just clarifying. So, day 1 plus day 2 plus day 1 plus 4 days plus 3 days, that's plural, but it all makes up a singular of 11 days. Okay, or like I just expressed, one lifetime comprises of many plural days, years, days, months, weeks, hours, seconds. Okay. But years, the word years is a singular unit of time. Okay, so my spirit will not contend with man forever. His mortal days will be 120 years. So my spirit will not contend with mankind, for his mortal length of days, a plural of days, will be a singular of 120 years. That's how we can read that scripture. That just brings us a little bit more clarity as to what God is actually saying. The singular unit of years added together in plurality makes a single unit of days. That's the right way of saying it. So it's been many, many thousands of years since God said that, okay, of limiting the days to 120 years, and we're still here in a mortal condition. So what's going on? What type of years is God referring to? So then we start reading scripture a bit further, and we see there's different types of years. There's a standard calendar year, which sort of in the Old Testament was a lunar calendar, roughly 360 days that followed a lunar cycle. But even if we're looking at a Gregorian calendar, it's 365 days, which is more of a solar cycle. Okay, so that's a standard year, 365 days, 12 months, etc., 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 24 hours a day. Okay. You get a Sabbath year, which is in Leviticus 25 verses 1 to 7. And God told them to leave the land without harvesting every 7th year. Okay, so you work the land year 1 through to 6, and then after year 6, in the 7th year, you leave that piece of ground alone, and whatever the ground yields wild on its own, you can eat straight out the ground, but you can't harvest the land. Okay, and that's the Sabbath year. You let the land rest. So a Sabbath year is actually a plurality of 7 calendar years. You see, but it's called a Sabbath year. Singular Sabbath year is a plurality of 7 calendar years. Right, so you get where I'm going here. Then in Leviticus 25 verses 8 to 13, we get another type of year concept that God instructed, God ordained and planned, is called a Jubilee year. So what is a Jubilee year? Every 50 years in the Jewish calendar was a Jubilee year. So if anyone had sold land to someone, they would get their piece of land back in that 50th year. It would be returned to them. Okay, so when someone purchased a piece of land from you, they weren't purchasing it outright. They were purchasing the harvest, the number of harvests that they could get before they'd have to give the piece of land back to you. Okay, if any Jew was enslaved, he couldn't pay his debts, he had to become a slave, then in the Jubilee year, they were required to free the Jewish slave. So he was allowed to be a free person again, he or she, and live as a free member of society again, unless they chose to remain a slave. Okay, so that's called the Jubilee year. Liberty and freedom proclaimed across the whole nation of Israel. A beautiful, beautiful, beautiful idea. Gosh, we can really ponder on Jubilee a lot, you know. But the point is that it was the 50th calendar year. So what do you find in a Jubilee year? You find that there was a plurality of seven Sabbath years. So 7 times 7 would be 49. Okay, and we also have a plurality. I'm just struggling with that word. We also have a plurality of 50 calendar years. Okay, but it still makes a single Jubilee year. So this concept of a Jubilee year has in my view, the only potential of unlocking Genesis 6 verses 1 to 3 and understanding what God was saying. So, and then there's another clue in Isaiah 13 verse 14. Let me just go find it super quickly. Isaiah 13 verse 14, we see a little clue because it speaks about the end times when Jesus returns to the earth. Okay, that's Isaiah 13 is speaking about that. And then in that chapter, he actually makes this statement. Like a hunted gazelle, like a sheep without a shepherd, each will return to his own people, each will flee to his native land. So what do we see in the Jubilee year? Slaves were released to go back to their land. The land was returned to them. They were released from slavery. You see what I'm saying? And so you can read earlier in Isaiah 13 where it says the day of the Lord is coming. It's a cruel day of wrath and all sorts. The stars of heaven, stars and constellation will not show their light. The sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. We know that from Matthew 24, verse 29 and 30, I think it is. That's exactly what happens when Jesus returns. All right. And then people will return to his, from wherever they are. So immigrants are going to return. Okay. So it's like a little clue saying that year is going to be a Jubilee year, because people are going to return to where they come from. They're going to be released to go back. Okay, it's a little clue, I think. So it's highly likely that the day of the Lord, the day that he returns in wrath, that year specifically will be a Jubilee year. So if Genesis 6 verses 1 to 3 is counting Jubilee years, well then that starts to make a bit of sense, because 120 Jubilee years equals 6,000 years. The completion of 6,000 years. You see, and we know in Revelation 19 or 20, I forget which one it is, that Jesus will rule for 1,000 years. So that's where we get the 7,000. So we know at the completion of 6,000 years, Jesus is coming back, and he's going to rule for 1,000 years. Now, when did 6,000 years start? That's an interesting question. Well, I'll ask you another question. When did man become mortal? Because God says, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. The reason he wasn't contending with mankind forever is because of his mortality. There was a point when man was not mortal. Adam and Eve were walking around the garden sinless, immortal and sinless. So God didn't have a problem with those years. Okay, so whenever Adam sinned, that's when mortality started. Okay, so we're counting from that day, that year, I suppose, that day and year. Now here's the thing. It is probably more logical that God is working with a Hebrew calendar. Okay. And now the difficulty with this is the Hebrew calendar was recalculated just within the last century as the Jews started to come back to their land in Israel, 1948. Okay. They had lost track. And they had to trust one of their biggest rabbis to sort of recalculate the calendar. So we're currently sitting at a Hebrew calendar in the Gregorian year of 2022 /23. We're sitting at a Hebrew year of 5783. All right. Which suggests that we've got a lot of time. It's about 218 years or so, 217 years. Okay, before 6,000 years are finished. But it's a little bit problematic. Okay, because there's two potential miscalculations. All right. One is that there is widely accepted that there's a 166-year error in the making of that calendar, which relates to the time difference of between Temple 1 and Temple year. When they created this current Hebrew calendar, they worked on 490 years, but it's been correctly recalculated as 656 years. So we're probably more accurately sitting in a Hebrew year of 5948. Okay, that only leaves 52 years. However, if we read the genealogy in the Septuagint version of scriptural writings, there's also an error there in some of the ages. So we find that there's also an error there in some of the ages, which adds on quite a few years. So we are much closer to the 6,000 years than we probably even realize. And again, probably the key here, or a major consideration, let me put it that way, is the Hebrews count from the year of Adam's creation, which I find problematic because Genesis 6 says that God is thinking about the mortality of man. And so we don't know how long Adam was alive for before he sinned. That's an unknown factor. How many years was that? Okay. I have my personal theory, which I won't share right now. Okay. And what we need to remember also is that according to Daniel's 70-week prophecy, we're still missing that last week of 7 years. Okay, we still have to enter that last week of 7 years. So whenever 6,000 years are, count back 7 years, so 5,993 years, and we're going to see the beginning of the tribulation. Anyone who's watching and who understands Scripture will probably start to define who the Antichrist is, although he's technically only revealed in the middle of those 7 years, okay, when he breaks the covenant with Israel and installs his image to be worshipped. So we've got that 7-year period. So the reality is, if 6,000 years is almost up, then we are just on the cusp of potentially entering the Great Tribulation. That is, there's a lot to take on there, actually, you know. And again, part of the reason that I make these clips are to really just to exhort people, encourage people, just ponder your own life. Please, 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 please do it. Do it now. Do it today. I make every effort. I've explained why I've taken a biblical position right at the beginning of this whole series. Okay, and I make every effort not to sort of just preach outright. I believe the Bible is logical. It's rational. Anybody who would take the time to sit and think consciously for themselves should be able to see the rationality and the logic that is in the Bible. There's so many other evidences, just so by the way. But you know, just consider this. If I'm right, let's say I am addressing you today from the sort of the correct side of understanding spirituality and the existence of humanity and the existence of creation. And let's say I'm speaking from that perspective, just for a moment. Just you know, work with me, entertain me for a moment. Okay, let's say I'm on that side and I'm on the right side. Then isn't it worth your while to give it some consideration? Like right now, I'm just talking sort of to a camera. There's no conversation, so there's nothing for you necessarily to engage with. You can take your time and ponder and consider carefully for yourself what the implications and consequences are for you. You don't even have to tell anybody else. When I met Jesus, I didn't talk to anyone. I just told him, I asked him directly, if you're real, talk to me. That's what I did. And that's what we're encountering in so many Muslim worlds across the world, Muslim nations across the world. People are having dreams and they're encountering Jesus without even speaking to another human, you know. And so that's what I'm asking you to do. Just ponder it for yourself. If I'm right, then there are massive implications if a person has not accepted the Creator's stipulated method of approach in entry before him. Okay. If I'm wrong, well then, hey man, the egg's on my face, isn't it? You know what I'm saying? You lose nothing. You lose nothing by considering what I'm suggesting. So I want to just implore you. To me, the Creator and the logic for having one Creator and one method of approach is undeniable. He's moral. He's good. That morality and goodness is outside of the scope of mankind. And if he is moral and good, then how can we approach him? If you're honest with yourself and you realize that you've made mistakes in your life, then and he's supremely good, never made mistakes, then we've got a massive problem to deal with. How can impurity ever approach purity? You see. So, and now, your efforts to approach Him are never going to work, because you're always approaching from a position, from a foundation of impurity. It is highly frustrating. Let me tell you, it is so frustrating. If you reach that place eventually and you realize the Creator is pure, completely pure, and you want Him, you actually choose Him and you want to be with Him, then you have to face this extreme problem that you cannot approach Him, because your foundation is already starting from a bad place. And no amount of attempts on your behalf is ever going to get there. You're never going to reach Him. So we need an intermediary. We need someone who was completely pure and completely human, and who died pure. His death was unjust. You see, there is only one person who ever matches that description, ever, in all of history. I'm still approaching from a logical, historical perspective here right now. Okay, I'm not even talking religion. Okay, there's only one human who was perfectly perfect and died unjustly. Only one. And His name is Jesus of Nazareth. You might not want to hear that, but I urge you to consider Him, because He's the one who traverses that gap that you are struggling with. When you accept Him, that He is the one who has pierced a hole through the barrier of death, and you accept Him, that's your path, that's your route to the Creator, only through Jesus Christ. And that, I understand, might be a difficult thing for some people to accept. So, but again, I urge you to ponder it, and I've gone on a long time. So anyway, 6,000 years is almost up. I urge you to consider the Creator for your own life. And again, like I've just said, I urge you to consider Jesus Christ as your only way to the Creator. So God bless. For some reason, I feel to say message me. So if that's you, and message me. Let's start a conversation. Okay. So God bless, and I'll chat to you again in the next episode.